Hello, welcome to lesson number 2 of Mastering Java Volume 3. I'm Jason with CodeLearner.com. Here we're going to continue working with methods, and we're finally going to learn what methods are really used for. You know, this is the kind of thing I want to teach in lesson number 1 when you very first learn Java, but you can't teach methods and how they work until you have a lot of foundation, which we've been building. Basically, you can't put large programs all inside of a main method like this. It gets cumbersome. So it's very common to split your program up into little sub-chunks or functional chunks that reside in methods. And we'll expand on this further when we start talking about classes and objects and the object-oriented nature of Java. But for now, even without all that stuff, we know that it might make sense to do that. And in the last section, we investigated some methods, and in those methods, we called the method and it printed something to the screen, but the method didn't do anything in those cases other than just print something to the screen. So now we're going to expand on that. Methods can be thought of as a black box, right? A black box. You pass numbers or parameters into this box we call a method. The method does something, a calculation usually, or some sort of function. And in many cases, the method returns a value back to where or whoever called it. So we might have some code here and we want to do a calculation. So we create a method down here, which will do that calculation, compartmentalize it, and the result will be then passed back to wherever we called from. So just think of our previous example, and when we're calling methods and we bounce back, now we're expanding that. We're going to be passing values down to a function. A calculation will be done, or some computation or something, and then a value will come back up to where we started. So let's stop talking about it and do it, and I'll just show you very quickly and easily how simple it is to make methods work and simplify your code. So let's declare a couple of variables. We're going to declare the first variable. We'll call it number num1, let's call it. And let's assign to that value the number, let's call it 11. All right, so we're going to do that. Now let's create a method where we want to take whatever number we pass into that method and multiply by, like, I don't know, 8, let's say. So the purpose of this method that we're going to create is just to take a number and multiply it by another number. It's very, very simple. You don't really need a method to do that, but it's to illustrate the point. So we want to declare a method. So we, again, use our public static keywords. For now, I'll explain what these are in a little bit later when we get a little deeper into the course. But for now, we're just putting this at the beginning of our methods. And in the past, we have used the word void. And I told you that void means the method doesn't really return any values. For instance, in the previous lesson, we were just printing things to the screen. There was nothing returned, no values returned. But here we want to do a calculation, and so we're going to return a number back to where we came from. So we use the keyword integer because we plan to return an integer back to hold the answer, basically to pass the answer back. And since we're dealing with integers, it makes sense. Now, if we were dealing with decimals, we would be returning a double value. If we were dealing with Booleans, we would be returning a Boolean value, but for this example, we're returning an integer. Now we need to give our method a name, so let's call it something easy. Multiply number. Multiply numbers. So let's do it this way. Mult numbers. We'll call it mult numbers. So we open up a parentheses, and also remember in the previous lesson, our parentheses I told you were empty before. And that's because those are very simple methods. But here we want to pass this number down into this method so that a calculation can be done. We need to tell Java what to expect. You're basically declaring sort of a template for this method and telling Java what to expect. We know it's going to return an integer. That's why this is here. We need to tell Java to expect to receive an integer when we call the method. So we have to tell it to receive an integer, and we're going to give it a name. And in this case, I'm going to use variable a. Basically, I'm declaring a variable that's an integer. I'm calling it a. And whenever I declare it this way, I'm saying, here, Java, declare a method. We're calling the name of this method mult numbers, multiply numbers. You should expect to receive a single integer. There's only one integer here, and we're going to call it a for the time being. And the calculation will be done, and we're going to return an integer answer back to where we came from. So methods have to have curly braces. So we open a curly brace, hit enter, and we have our closing curly brace. Now, this curly brace here, the extent of this open and curly brace, everything inside of it is what this method is going to do. Notice that it's underlined red. If you hover your mouse over it, says this method must return a result of type integer. The reason it's telling you that is because we have an integer out here. It's just reminding you, hey, you got to do a calculation and you have to return an integer, otherwise this isn't going to work, because I basically told Java, expect an integer to come back out of it. So what we're doing now is we want to declare another integer in here that we're going to call answer. And we're going to set it equal to the value that we've passed down, a, and we said we want to multiply by 11. Remember, the purpose of this particular method is just to take a number and called a parameter. When you pass a value into a method, it's called passing a parameter. This return type here is telling it what type of number you're going to return there. So what's happening here is we're going to end up taking this number 11, passing it into this method. Actually, let me change this to make it a little bit easier. Let's change the method so it multiplies times 7. That'll be a little easier to wrap our brains around. So we take a number, we pass it to our method, we multiply whatever number we pass times 7, and we restore it in this local variable that we've declared as an integer, and we call it the variable answer. So we've done the calculation, and now we need to return, so you use the keyword return answer with a semicolon. This method definition is now complete. We've declared a method. We've told Java it's going to return an integer, and look, that's what we're doing. We're returning an integer. This is declared as an integer here. All right? We're taking as an argument, or in Java you call it a parameter, a single integer, a single number, and that number that we pass is then a calculation is done with it, and then we store it into a variable, and now we're returning the answer. All right? Now, all we need to do up above is to actually call the function. So let's declare a variable called answer, like this. And then we will basically say answer is equal to, and now we're going to call that function, multiply numbers. Now we have to pass it a value. We'll pass it the value of num1, which is what we have declared up above. And then down below, we'll do system.out.println, like this. We'll open it up and we'll say the result is, and then we'll just do a plus sign and we'll do answer. Make sure you understand that even before we rock and roll and kind of continue to do it, basically we store the value of 11 into a variable. We call a method and we pass that number down to this method. So this number 11 is now stored in this local variable that we're calling a. We do whatever we want to down here, whatever the point of it is. In a more complicated program, we might be using it to calculate, you know, the lighting on a game character, or to calculate the movement of something on the screen, or whatever. But there's a function down here that's operating on some information. So we do that calculation here, we store it in an integer, and we return that integer, which we've already told Java, expect that this method is going to return an integer, and lo and behold, when we call this guy, we're assigning the value to an integer variable up here. So it's a way to compartmentalize the computation of what's happening inside of a method, and then you can read this code much easier. You say, okay, we declare some variables, we call a method whose purpose is to multiply numbers, that's compartmentalized down here, we get the answer and we print it. So I can have methods for all kinds of things. Now let me go and run this, and what we get, the result is 77, because number 11 gets passed down here, multiplied times 7, the number 77 is stored here and returned back to whence it came, and that number 77 is stored in this variable, and then we print the answer out. So this is an example when you have a method that takes a single parameter and does a very simple operation on it and returns a very simple answer back to the caller. So that's the extent of kind of the first part of this lesson that I want to point out to you here. Now I want to show you though real quick that the way I've done it here is I've called the method, I've stored the answer in a variable here, and then I printed out the result. But actually, let me comment this out just with a double slash like that. Notice the way I've done it here, I've stored the answer here, but actually I can take this here and I can just type directly in mult numbers. I'm just showing an alternate way of doing this like this. You see, the result is going to be printed out. The value here is exactly what I had done before, but instead of storing it in a variable and then putting the variable here, let me clear the screen and run this, you can see that the behavior of the code is exactly the same, because the system.out.println function, it's basically looking for either text in quotations or some kind of a number, an integer, a double, or something like that. This method is defined to return an integer. So no matter how I call this method, an integer is going to come back. And so what happens is I put this here, this number 11 gets passed down, a number gets sent back. So when you look at this, you should read it as this method is returning a number, and that number is going into the system.out.println function. So you can use your methods to assign to variables, and I find that a little more readable, or you can just shorten the code and put it directly into your print statements like this. So let's change it back to the way it was before. And so we'll take this out, we'll save it, we'll clear this guy, and we'll print to make sure that it works the way we expect it to. And what I want to do now is create another function. So what I'm going to do now is change this print statement is when we multiply num1 by 7, we get, so I'm going to change this a little bit, by 7 we get 77. Notice that as we change this number, if we change it to 8, for instance, save and run, the calculation changes because we're just changing the variable. So let me change it back to 11. Now I want to create a separate function, or a separate method, I should say. And this other method, instead of multiplying a single number times 7, I want to operate on two guys there. And so that's very, very common thing to do and very simple to do in Java. So let me declare another number here. Integer number 2 is equal to, let's call it 7, something like that. And just to make it absolutely clear, I'm going to change this from answer to answer1, because I'm now creating another method here. Make sure the method still works. Got an error, so let's see if we can track down where it is. So answer1 is equal to whatever we call here. Method still works fine. So what I want to do now is declare another variable called answer2. Because now I want to create another method, and I want to now create a method that's going to take as arguments or parameters these two numbers and add them, and then take the result back to the top. All right, so now we create another method. We just go down here. Notice I'm still operating inside of this bracket, inside of our class definition. Notice it's called public class lesson 2. So we're declaring our methods for now inside of that class. Let me go ahead and declare it as public static. Again, it's going to be an integer. And instead of multiply, I'm going to call it add numbers. And I have to tell Java what to expect to receive for this method. So I'm going to tell it to expect, just to make it absolutely clear, we'll call it integer x and integer y. All right, I'm going to expect two values to go there. I'm going to open a curly brace and hit enter. And now I have a definition of another guy here. And if you hover over the red, it tells you again, this method must return a type integer. That makes sense because I put integer out here. So here I want to have a method to add two numbers. So it's expecting two integers to be passed here, and it's renaming them x and y so I can work with them locally down here. So I will create integer answer, and that will be equal to x plus y, like that. And then I'll return answer, like that. All right. Now notice that I have this variable ANS up here, and I have this variable ANS down here. Well, this variable definition is contained inside of here, and this variable definition is contained inside of here. So there's no crosstalk between these methods. The code's not going to get confused that there's two different ways here. In fact, I could use A and B right here. I just try to change the names when I can to keep it clear. So make sure you know what's happening. We're going to call this second method here. The first number is going to be stored here. The second number is going to be stored in y. We're going to add them together. We're storing the value in an answer, and we're returning the answer back. And it's going to be a return type of type integer. So now we'll say answer2 is equal to add numbers. And we need to pass it two numbers. So I'm going to pass it num1, num2. And I'm going to put my semicolon. Notice there's no red anywhere. Now, this method and this method are totally different things. The multiply method, it expects to receive one number, and the reason it knows that is because we've defined it to receive one number here. And this add numbers method expects to receive two numbers, and that's because we've defined it to receive two numbers. So they have to match. Whatever you call it with has to be in a similar matching way to what you have down here. If I accidentally try to call add numbers with only one number like this and click off of it, you can see it has an underline. It says the method is not applicable for the argument list because I don't have enough arguments here. So it's going to catch that stuff. It's not going to work unless you have everything matching up. So I'm passing the two numbers here. It's 11 and 77. I'm passing that down here. A calculation's being done. I'm returning the answer as an integer. Back up above, it's being stored here. So then I can say system.out.println, and then I can go over here and say, when we add the two numbers, we get, or let me do it this way. Instead of adding the two numbers, let's do, when we add num1 and num2, we get, we'll do a colon, and here it's going to be answer 2. Because that's the variable I stored the answer in. So let me go and run that guy. And let me go ahead and put a line break here. \n. So let me save that and run it. So here we get 18 for the second one. So this guy is basically doing the multiplication. That's calling this method there. We're getting that. Then we're calling the other method. And we add them together, we get 18 because 11 plus 7 is indeed 18. So these numbers are getting passed down, calculations being done. Down here, it's returning the answer back to where we came, so this can be read as a number is being calculated, store it over here, and then we print it out. Now the last thing I want to do, just to kind of drill this home, is in the first guy we showed that you can use an integer and you can pass an integer back. All right, and then we also passed an integer back here. This guy is taking one number as an argument. This guy is taking two numbers as an argument. But the return type, being an integer, can be any of the valid return types. If I'm doing calculations with decimals, I'm going to be returning a double. If I'm doing calculations with integers, I'm going to return an integer. If I'm doing calculations with booleans, which are the true-false type of guys, then I'm going to be doing those. So I'd like to do a quick example with Boolean. So what I want to do now is create a third method and to basically check to see if these two numbers are equal. If they're equal, it'll return true as a Boolean. And if it's not equal, in this case they're not equal, it'll return a false. So let's go down here and let's create yet another third function. So we'll do public static. Now we don't want to choose integer because this method's not going to return an integer. It's going to return a Boolean. Like this. That's a true-false type of variable, if you remember. We want to take as an argument two values, so integer. I could choose some of these others up here, but let's just choose integer r and integer t. I'm kind of choosing different variables also to show you that it doesn't really matter. Basically what happens is whatever variables you define here as the parameters are only local to your method here. So it doesn't really matter exactly what you call it. So here I'm calling r and t, but they're basically going to be assigned value num1 and num2 when you call this method down here. All right, so we have our method we're trying to declare. We have to give it a name. We've declared that it's going to return a Boolean value. So let's call it equal numbers, because I'm trying to basically figure out if these numbers are going to be equal. So inside of here, and I'm passing the two numbers and renaming them as r and t variables. So inside of here, basically what I want to do is I want to say if r is equal to t, and this is a single line if statement, then I'm going to return a value of true because it's true that these guys are equal. And then I'm going to have an else statement. Else, the only other thing that could possibly happen is returning false. Like this. So there's only two states of a Boolean variable. It's true or false. So I'm basically checking to see if the two numbers are equal. And if they are, I'm returning a true value. Otherwise, I'm returning a false value. And so the only purpose of this method is to basically see if these numbers are equal. And that's why I'm calling them equal numbers. So I have three methods: multiply a number, add two numbers together, which takes two arguments, and then check to see if two numbers are equal. This one's returning a Boolean value. So then up above here, I can then say, I'll create a variable, and I'll call it Boolean answer 3. All right, and I'll say answer 3 is equal to equal numbers, and I'll pass along to that method number 1, number 2. There, and I'll put a semicolon. So basically what I've done is I've called the method, I've passed the two values down there, it's checking to see if they're equal, and if so, then the value of true is going to come back and be assigned into here. So then I will come here and I will say system.out.println, and then I will come in here and I will say number 1 and number 2 are, and I'll put equal, are equal, and I'll just put the value here, answer 3. So basically what's going to happen is it's going to say number 1 and number 2 are equal, and it'll put true or false. All right, so after all of that stuff, let's go ahead and run this guy. Let's clear it off and run it with the values of, our two values are 11 and 7. So what we have here is we multiply number 1 by 7, we get 77. We add number 1 and number 2 together, we get 18. Number 1 and number 2 are equal, and it says false. Now we can change this. Let's change variable 1 so that we have a 7 here and see how things are altered. We multiply number 1 by 7, we get 49. We add number 1 and number 2, we get 14. Number 1 and number 2 are equal, and now it says true because they're equal. So you can hopefully see now this is still a very, very simple program with 3 different methods that do different things. But it's much, much more readable code because here I can say, all right, I'm going to get an answer after I call the multiply number method. I'm going to get an answer after I call the adding number method. I'm going to get another answer after I check to see if they're equal. And I can read this code a lot easier having all of these little methods, these little logical things compartmentalized down below. And that's basically the main advantage of using methods. You can imagine a larger program when you would have a lot more things going on. You would, if you were writing a game engine or something, you could write little methods to do different things, and then you write the larger code up here in the main method to unite everything together and control the overall program flow of what you're trying to do. Now I do want to show you one more thing before I close it off. If you go down here to my methods, I've kind of done them all the same. I've taken the parameter in, I've done some calculation, assigned it to a local variable here, and I've returned that variable. Here I've taken the numbers in, I've done a calculation, assigned it to some local variable, and I've returned the variable. Here I've kind of done almost the same thing, but now I'm just returning true or false statements. This is done this way in this example here for clarity so that you can see exactly what's happening. But really you can kind of eliminate this. You don't really need this. The only thing you need to really have for your method here is to do a calculation and return an integer because we're telling Java to expect an integer back. So in fact I can take this out and I can just do something like this. Return, and I can, if I want to improve my clarity or whatever, I can do a times 7. So what's happening here is the method comes in with the number a, right? It multiplies a times 7. That's going to result in an integer. And then the return statement says return that integer back to where you came from. So let me go ahead and save it, clear the buffer out here and run it. And you can see that we get the right answer. So, it just depends on how explicit you want to be with your code. You can define variables here, do things, and then return the variable, or you could just do the calculation and return directly. I could do the same thing here if I wanted to. I could take this guy out, and instead of returning this, I could just take parentheses and put them around x plus y for clarity, and then I can just say return x plus y. So it's returning an integer because this calculation should result in an integer. When I run it again, I get the right answer. If I change this to 102 for number 2, then of course I get different answers. So I hope you understand how methods work. At very basic level, you can use them just to print things to the screen and keep that code kind of separate. That's kind of nice, but really they're really used to go and do a function. And the way that you have them do a function is they're going to have to take arguments that we call parameters in Java and do a calculation or perform some function and return a value back. All right, so when you're defining your methods, if they're going to take integers, you need to define that. If they're going to return integers, you need to have that out in front, or in this case, booleans. If you're going to return a double or some other variable, you need to have the return type listed out here. And if your method doesn't return anything at all, you put void here because in that case, it's not really returning a value back to where it came. I strongly recommend that you go work the exercises for this lesson. I think I've given you a good overview here, but when you work the exercises and do it yourself, you're going to get a lot of practice with methods, and they're so important in Java, especially when we get over into objects and classes, and all of this stuff is building. So make sure you understand this rock solid, then follow me on to the next lesson where we will continue mastering Java.